Chapter 56 is going to focus on conservation biology and global change. So you see there a forest that is being broken down by humans, and why that is going to play a role in this chapter. So far, scientists have named and described approximately 1.8 million species, but biologists estimate that there's between 10 to 100 million species that are currently living on our planet. Tropical forests contain some of the greatest concentrations of these species, and because they are going through deforestation, they are destroying quite a number of those species that have yet to be identified. Humans are rapidly pushing species towards extinction, so conservation biology, which its primary goal is to preserve life, integrates several fields: ecology, physiology, molecular biology, genetics, and evolutionary biology to try to achieve its primary goals. Human activities threaten Earth's biodiversity. Rates of species extinction are pretty difficult to determine naturally. Um, the higher rates that we are seeing with species extinction is primarily due to ecosystem degradation by humans. So, therefore, humans are responsible for a lot of the biodiversity issues that we are currently facing. Three main components making up biodiversity: genetic, species, and ecosystem. Genetic, remember back when we did this, the variations that allow populations to be able to adapt to environmental changes. We talked about the relationship between genetics and evolution, natural selection. Species diversity, by having a wide range of species, it helps to maintain your community structure and also is going to play a key role with your food webs. And then ecosystem diversity, as we just recently talked about, we saw that ecosystems are able to provide ways to recycle nutrients and to decompose waste. So you can have genetic diversity not just within your population, but also between populations. Species diversity is looking at the different numbers of species that are present within an ecosystem or throughout the entire biosphere. Endangered species, according to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, is one that is in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species is not endangered yet, but is likely to be in the future. Conservation biologists are very concerned about species loss because of the statistics that are out there regarding species and biodiversity. 12% of birds, 21% of mammals, 32% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. You can have both local and global extinction. So, those are some examples of species that are in the endangered or threatened species realm right now. Ecosystem diversity. Human activity is reducing this diversity. It's reducing the variety of ecosystems that are present in our biosphere. Within the contiguous US, over 50% of wetlands have been drained and converted to other ecosystems. Local extinction of one species can have a significant impact, often negatively, on other species that are present in that ecosystem. So, one example would be flying foxes. They're important pollinators and seed dispersers in the Pacific Islands. So, if they go extinct, you won't have them there to be able to help with pollination and seed dispersal. Biodiversity and human welfare. Human biophilia helps us look at biodiversity just because, it's an amazing thing that we have all these different species present on our planet. There are also some practical benefits to it. We have agricultural crops that come from some of these species that can have some important genetic attributes: virus resistant commercial rice, prescriptions, the ability to generate medications that can inhibit cancer growth, the rosy periwinkle with alkaloids. And by losing species, we're losing genes, we're losing diversity. And by losing diversity, we are losing the potential for other compounds or species that would be beneficial to us as humans. So, ecosystem services, all the processes that ecosystems and their species are doing to help to sustain human life. Examples include purifying air and water, detoxifying decomposing waste, cycling nutrients, moderating weather extremes. So, species loss can be traced to four major threats: habitat destruction, introduced species, overharvesting, and global change. Within habitat loss, this is the one that's having the greatest impact on the loss of or the reduction of biodiversity throughout the biosphere. Habitat fragmentation and destruction tends to lead to this. So in Wisconsin, the prairie is only taking up less than 0.1% of what it originally did, and 93% of coral reefs have been damaged by human behaviors. Introduced species. This is when humans move species from their native locations to new regions. Sometimes this is done deliberately, sometimes this is done accidentally. But if they are placed into an environment where they do not have their predators or pathogens, any sort of parasites that can impact on their growth and help to restrain it, introduced species can spread quite quickly, and once they gain a foothold, they typically will disturb the balance within species in their new community. Again, sometimes this happens by accident. Brown tree snake arrived in Guam as a cargo ship stowaway, led to the extinction of some local species. And then humans actually did deliberately introduce kudzu. You can literally watch kudzu grow leaves if you sat at the plant for a whole day. That stuff is out of control. Um, when I first moved here, I broke a shovel on it at the house I was living at, and my dad was like, "There is no way you broke it." And then the root, I think, was a good 6 feet long. It was out of control. So you have probably seen kudzu. I know I've seen some in the parking lot at school. Over harvesting, when we take too much of a particular plant or animal and we don't give that population the ability to rebound because we are harvesting it at rates that exceed its ability to replace itself, that would be an example of overharvesting. Large organisms with low reproductive rates, like elephant populations, are especially vulnerable to this because people want their ivory. So, conservation biologists can use DNA to identify sources of animal products, specifically with ivory. They can determine that original elephant population that it came from within a few hundred kilometers, which is pretty amazing. And then overfishing has decimated wild fish populations. Bluefin tuna in the North Atlantic has decreased by 80% in 10 years. Global change, alterations in our climate, our atmospheric chemistry, broad ecological systems. Acid precipitation from burning of fossil fuels that can travel via from regions via the air. We can also have pollution, which will help to move that along. Industrial pollution in the Midwestern US generated acid rain in eastern Canada back in the 1960s. That precipitation is going to change the pH of other aquatic environments. It can kill fish, other lake dwelling organisms. So, environmental regulations have been put in place to help to decrease this precipitation. Sulfur dioxide emissions, which are one way that those acids are able to be formed from those gases. Sulfur dioxide and I want to say nitrogen dioxide have decreased 31% between 1993 and 2002. So, that's part of the reason some regulations are placed to help with these broader issues. So population conservation is going to look at size, genetic diversity, and critical habitat. When biologists are looking at conservation on both population and species level, they tend to look at it in two ways. With a small population approach, they are looking at processes that can make small populations go extinct. With declining population approach, they are looking at both threatened and endangered populations. They're not concerned about the size of those populations, but once they're showing a decrease in that population, and they look at the environmental factors that cause the decline in that population. So, extinction vortex is a key issue with small populations because there is more likely to be inbreeding and genetic drift. So, the factor that's driving that vortex is that we're losing genetic variation, which is reducing that particular population's ability to respond to environmental changes, survival of the fittest, random selection, natural selection. So when we reduce that diversity, that's going to keep minimizing those changes, and it may make it less likely that that population is able to survive the environmental changes it's now encountering. It's not an absolute. And that's kind of a picture. You see the small population inbreeding genetic drift that reduces your variability, which reduces your fitness and the population's ability to adapt. That could lead to lower reproduction, that could lead to increased deaths, and that would lead to an even smaller population where you continue on with this vortex. So, one example of this is the greater prairie chicken. It was populations were fragmented by agriculture and were having decreased fertility. So scientists decided to study or to examine this hypothesis about extinction vortex by transplanting birds from larger populations of greater prairie chickens to the smaller ones. The declining populations rebounded, and so it was the hypothesis was supported that the reduced genetic variation was what was causing the decline in the populations that had been fragmented. Minimum viable population, MVP, is the population size a species must have in order to be able to survive. It will depend on factors that affect that population's ability to survive over periods of time. To do that, we need to look at effective population size, basically um, what are its ability or its potential to breed successfully. And you've got the equation there for effective population size. You need to look at your males and your females and to determine what that effective population size is in terms of the ones that are breeding successfully. Viability analysis can kind of be used to determine, is the population going to be okay, or are there going to be concerns over a period of time. Grizzly bear populations. So this was one of the first population viability analyses conducted. It's done in the Yellowstone National Park. It's estimated that 100 bears would have about 95% chance of making it for about 200 years. So the grizzly population is about 400, but the NE is 100. So that's showing that there's low genetic variability compared to other grizzly populations. So by introducing individuals from other grizzly bear populations, that should increase your variation and increase these numbers. So with declining population, we want to make sure the population is in decline. We want to look at the history of that species, consider any potential sources of decline and develop hypotheses for them, test them based on the ones that we feel are most likely to have an impact. And then once we have determined what seems to be having the greatest impact on the decline, try to come up with ways to apply those results so that we can improve recovery efforts. So red-cockaded woodpecker. So these require living trees in mature pine forest that have little undergrowth because of human actions. Logging, agriculture, fire suppression have reduced the habitats for these woodpeckers. They have a pretty complex social structure where the breeding pair has one or up to four helper individuals. There tends to be a better chance of reproducing by helping and then waiting for an available cavity instead of excavating new ones. So when breeding cavities were constructed, only new breeding groups were formed in those places. So it was determined based on this experiment that we needed to maintain habitats, and being able to excavate breeding cavities for new breeding groups enabled the species to be able to rebound. So there's your low undergrowth, and then there's the ones with the high dense undergrowth. We have to find ways to deal with potential conflicts between endangered species habitat needs as well as human demands. In the Pacific Northwest, preserving habitats for species is not looked on along as favorably by the timber and mining industries who want those resources to be able to make income. So managing habitats can have positive effects for that particular species, but they could have negative effects on others. Landscape regional conservation help to sustain biodiversity. So, conservation biology has attempted to sustain the biodiversity that's present not just within populations, but communities, ecosystems, and landscapes. Ecosystem management is part of this. It uses biodiversity to help plan out land use. And if landscape is planned appropriately, it can have a significant impact on your biodiversity. So you can have natural edges, as you see in that picture at the top, and then you can have human activity edges. Those boundaries between the ecosystems are, we talked about that a little bit earlier, the overlap between ecosystems are defining features of your landscapes, and species that are right on the edge will take advantage of resources in both areas to get what they need to be able to continue to grow and to reproduce. So, the biological dynamics of forest fragments project in the Amazon looked at how fragmentation has played a role on biodiversity. And what they ascertained is that landscapes that were dominated by fragmented habitats supported fewer species because they lost species that had adapted to the interiors of those habitats. Okay, so there you can see a forest that is been broken apart. Movement corridors, narrow strip of quality habitat that otherwise connects isolated patches. These help with sustaining populations, they help to promote dispersal. Sometimes we might need to create artificial corridors, but that is one way to connect those fragments to one another and to help out those populations. Establishing protected areas. So, by identifying areas that have many endemic species, many endangered, many threatened species, biodiversity hotspots, those are great places for nature reserves, but we have to be able to identify them first. We tend to identify those hotspots based on vertebrates and plants, but those hotspots can change depending on how climate is changing. So there are some indications of both terrestrial and marine biodiversity hotspots. Nature reserves, biodiversity islands that are present in habitat that has been broken down by human actions. Nature reserves have to consider disturbances that are present because they're going to be part of all ecosystems. Does it make more sense to have smaller ones and have many, or to have larger ones and fewer? There are arguments for both. Larger reserves is that for your animals that are more far ranging, that have smaller, low density populations, they tend to require these more extensive habitats. Um, Based on human interactions, smaller reserves may be a little bit more realistic. They could also help to reduce disease spread throughout a population. So there's short term and long term. You can see the Yellowstone National Forest. The short term survival would be about 50 individuals. The long term survival, if we extended it out a little bit further, or a lot further, excuse me, would be 10 times that, 500. A zoned reserve model is that we are working in landscapes that tend to be human centered. So these zone reserves are going to have relatively undisturbed areas, and then they're going to have buffer zones that are going to separate it from the areas where humans are found, the modified areas between the zone reserved and the humans, conservation areas. Costa Rica has quite a few of these zoned reserves. The Fiji Islands also have as well, and by setting up these zone reserves, it's helped out with fishing in neighboring areas. The US has one of these with the Florida Keys. Our Earth is changing rapidly because of human choices. Preserves that are located today may not be the best place for those species in the future because of human changes or human caused changes, such as nutrient enrichment, toxin accumulation, climate change, and ozone depletion. So, nutrient enrichment, we talked about this a little bit in the last chapter. By transporting nutrients from one location to another, sometimes we are adding materials that are toxic to certain ecosystems, or we're taking out nutrients that those ecosystems need. Fertilizers are one way we can add things back to ecosystems that have been depleted. We do have to be careful with what we're adding back that we're not going to cause more negative or more have a more negative impact than we would have if we didn't add it in. Critical load, adding the amount of nutrients that can be absorbed by plants without damaging that ecosystem's integrity. If nutrients exceed the critical load, they tend to go into their aquatic ecosystems. They'll run off into them or they'll go into the groundwater. That can lead to additional resources in those ecosystems, which can lead to phytoplankton blooms or um, other changes in those particular ecosystems. So we don't want a benefit for one ecosystem to cause other negative impacts for a second ecosystem. So decomposing phytoplankton blooms will cause dead zones because there won't be oxygen present. So there you can see winter versus summer. Environmental toxins. We release lots of toxins that nature has not known previously. Some of those toxins will last for extended periods of time. They tend to be a little more harmful because they become more concentrated as you go through your trophic levels. Biological magnification is concentrating the toxins at higher trophic levels because you have a smaller biomass. PCBs, DDT, pesticide are definitely going to have biological magnification in our ecosystems. Herring gulls in the Great Lakes lay eggs with PCB levels that are 5,000 times greater than what was found in phytoplankton. Other toxins, DDT, Rachel Carson brought this up in 1960. It was banned in 1971 by the US. If you are in a country that has to deal with malaria, you have to trade off killing mosquitoes, which are vectors for malaria, or protecting species that feed off of mosquitoes. Greenhouse gases, global warming, increased levels of atmospheric CO2 due to fossil fuels, other human activities. Plants are going to grow more when you have increased CO2 levels. So, but it says most plants grow faster with CO2 levels, but not all. We talked about C3 and C4 plants earlier this year with photosynthesis. C3 plants, wheat and soybeans, are going to be limited by increased CO2, while corn plants are going to benefit from C4, from additional CO2. So, what else will CO2 impact? The FACTS-1 experiment tested how increased CO2 levels affects your tree growth, the carbon present in soils, your insect population, soil moisture, some other factors as well. The plots that were enriched with CO2 were able to generate more wood, but they didn't generate as much as was hypothesized. It seems that the nitrogen availability, as well as other nutrients, had an impact on how much those trees could grow and take up the CO2. So CO2, water vapor, other greenhouse gases are able to reflect infrared radiation back towards Earth, which is your greenhouse effect. We need the greenhouse effect to keep the Earth's surface temperature reasonable so that we can live and survive. If we increase atmospheric CO2, we're going to see increased global temperatures. We're seeing that a lot now with having, if you look at areas by the ocean, and if you look at what's happening in Antarctica, increased atmospheric CO2, again, is going to, sorry, I already said that one. Climatologists are able to look at past environments and their climates to kind of make predictions as to what's going to happen in the future. CO2 levels can be inferred from bubbles that were trapped in glacial ice, and we can use chemistry to get a prediction as to what past temperatures were. So the northern coniferous forests and tundra are showing the strongest effects of global warming. Arctic sea ice amounts are decreasing rapidly. Because of that, that's going to influence your precipitation amounts. Not every organism, or quite a few organisms, are not going to be able to survive climate change because it's going to happen too rapidly for natural selection to catch up with it. Assisted migration is something that some ecologists support, moving a species to a favorable habitat that is outside of where its native range is. As we've seen over the past couple of months, we can slow down global warming by reducing our energy needs, finding renewable sources. If we want to stabilize the CO2 emissions, it's going to have to be done globally. And there is still lots of work to be done with that. If we can also reduce deforestation, that will play a role in reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. Atmospheric ozone depletion. Earth and all the living species that are present on it are protected from UV radiation by the ozone that is present in the atmosphere. We have used satellite studies to determine that ozone layer has been thinning gradually since mid 1970s. It's felt that thinning is due primarily to chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which are made by humans performing different functions in their lives. CFCs contain chlorine, which then reacts with the ozone to make oxygen. And because it reacts, it's no longer ozone, and that reduces its quantity in the atmosphere. So there's that chemical reaction. I won't spend too much more time on that. The ozone layer is thinnest over Antarctica, Southern Australia, New Zealand, and South America. It has been decreasing between 2 to 10% in the mid latitudes over the past 20 years. By depleting your ozone, we are having greater damage DNA wise with our plants. We're having poor phytoplankton growth. And we have been working on that globally since back in 1987, which has resulted in a decrease in that ozone depletion. So in 1979, you can see that blue area there. And then looking at our planet in 2009, 30 years later, you can see how much bigger that splotch of blue is. So that's where that ozone layer is being depleted. Sustainable development is going to be one way that we can try to maintain biodiversity and meet the needs of the human population. Sustainable Biosphere Initiative is taking ecological information and using that to make good choices about the resources that we are using. So this is definitely going to be multidisciplinary. It's not just science. It's going to involve economics, humanities, as well as social sciences. So in Costa Rica, the conservation efforts that they've been doing there with their tropical biodiversity is not just scientists, it's governments, NGOs, private citizens. And what they have learned is that human living conditions have actually improved along with these conservation efforts. So you can see there where the infant mortalities are dropping quite rapidly and life expectancies have increased dramatically as they have been working on their conservation efforts. Our biosphere's future. Um, our lives differ a lot from your parents' lives, which differ a lot from their grandparents' lives, but they definitely differ a whole lot from the earlier humans that we talked about a little bit with evolution. Hunted, gathered, painted on cave walls. Our behaviors are going to have some remnants of that ancestral attachment to nature as well as its diversity, the biophilia that we've been talking about a lot this chapter. And hopefully that connection to nature will help us to make wiser choices. And by us, I'm talking the human population in terms of how we treat our environment.